The endorsement of gay rights remains one of the world's most controversial topics. The debate is endless and, for the most part, emotional. Whether or not African countries should endorse gay rights is not the focus of this production. Rather, let's look at Africa's current position on this controversial matter. Today, 3 out of every 5 African countries have laws that make homosexuality and the public expression of sexual or gender behavior that deviates from heterosexual norms illegal. These same laws frequently punish LGBTI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex rights advocacy. Some African countries have partially decriminalized or better protected LGBTI people. However, with the notable exception of South Africa, such people are still far from enjoying the same rights as other citizens across the continent. Furthermore, in recent years, there has been a trend toward tougher legislation, as well as crackdowns on homosexuals. The argument that non-conforming sexual orientations and gender identities were brought to Africa by Western colonizers and are contrary to African values is frequently used in support of discriminatory legislation and other measures targeting LGBTI people. This is yet another never-ending debate. In most African countries, LGBTI people face discrimination and violence. Against this backdrop, the EU institutions and member states face a difficult task. On the one hand, they are obligated under the treaties to promote EU core values in their external relations and to monitor and address abuses in their partner countries. However, their actions and declarations in this area risk reinforcing the perception that the EU is attempting to impose non-African values on Africa. Moreover, African countries are contesting the notion of sexual orientation and gender identity as grounds for discrimination in the multilateral arena. According to the International LGBTI Association (ILGA), 33 of the 54 African states recognized by the United Nations (UN) have laws that make same-sex sexual acts illegal. Article 354 of Chad's 2017 Penal Code is the world's most recent criminalization of same-sex sexual relations. Treatments, such as forensic anatomical examination, are sometimes associated with criminalization. Human Rights Watch claims that this occurs in Cameroon, Egypt, Kenya, Tunisia, Uganda, and Zambia. The death penalty is legal in Mauritania, for Muslim men, Nigeria, in some northern states, and Sudan. Homosexuality has never been criminalized in any of the other 21 African countries. However, provisions penalizing acts against nature, indecency, or debauchery are used against LGBTI people in some of them. Countries like Côte d'Ivoire and the Central African Republic have used such provisions to arrest LGBTI people. LGBTI organizations cannot be registered in Mali, Burkina Faso, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Only a few African countries have explicitly abolished criminalization. South Africa and Guinea-Bissau did so in 1993. The concept of vices against nature was removed from Mozambique's penal code in 2015 and Angola's in 2019. The majority of recommendations made by other UN member states to decriminalize or better protect LGBTI people are rejected by the African countries involved. Those who provide reasons for their rejection, citing the fact that sexuality is a private matter, or claiming that the recommendations are contrary to their country's values, customs, or religions, thus contesting the expression of sexual or gender preferences as a universal human right. A number of UN General Assembly resolutions urge governments to punish summary executions for any discriminatory reason, including sexual orientation and gender identity. On March 7, 2012, the UN Human Rights Council, HRC, held a panel discussion on sexual orientation and gender identity, during which state delegations and civil society panelists reaffirmed the universality of human rights. However, prior to the start of the discussion, a number of representatives left the council chamber to express their opposition to any discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity. Reportedly, the majority of African delegates did as well. Some of the remaining panelists emphasized that, because they had not been sufficiently defined and were not mentioned in any international human rights instrument, the concepts of sexual orientation and gender identity had no foundation in international human rights law. In the absence of universal agreement requiring states to recognize sexual orientation and gender identity as prohibited grounds for discrimination, no state should be forced to do so against its will. Any attempt to impose change in this area undermines the principles of universality and cultural pluralism, as well as the shared ownership of the international human rights program. What is in dispute is not the principle of human rights universality, but the inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity in the set of human rights. However, not all African countries share this viewpoint. The EU adopted LGBTI guidelines in 2013, requiring EU delegations and national embassies of EU member states to be proactive in promoting LGBTI rights. So far, such resolutions, or even sanctions, Denmark withheld aid to Tanzania in 2018, have not compelled African countries to change their legal framework. In 2016, none of the African member states of the Human Rights Council voted in favor of establishing a mandate for an independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity protection. The EU has now focused its LGBTI rights advocacy on individual African countries rather than at the regional level. South Africa was the first African country to legalize same-sex marriage in 2006, and it remains the only African country with a constitution that protects against discrimination based on sexual orientation. In 2018, a bill was introduced to criminalize hate crimes and hate speech, and in 2020, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the Civil Union Amendment Act, which prohibits marriage officers from refusing same-sex marriages. 7 African countries have legalized same-sex relationships in the last 10 years. Following the passage of a new law in February 2021, Angola became the latest African country to decriminalize same-sex relationships. The new law repealed a ban on same-sex relationships enacted during the country's time as a Portuguese colony and states that discrimination based on sexual orientation is punishable by up to 2 years in prison. The High Court of Botswana decriminalized both male and female same-sex relationships in 2019. It repealed a law that had been in effect since 1965, when the country was still under British rule, and made carnal knowledge of any person against the order of nature punishable by up to 7 years in prison. Mozambique repealed a colonial-era provision that prohibited same-sex relationships as vices against nature in 2015. LGBTQ+ people, however, continue to face discrimination and violence at home, work, school, and when seeking health care or police assistance. Homosexuality was illegal for men in Lesotho until 2010, when it was decriminalized completely. Seychelles decriminalized same-sex acts in May 2016, after lawmakers voted to amend the country's Penal Code Act, which made sodomy a felony punishable by up to 14 years in prison. Gabon and São Tomé and Príncipe complete the list. Will African countries reconsider? Will more countries support gay rights? Thanks for watching. If you like this type of content, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more stories.